But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In 1692, a quiet Puritan village in Massachusetts descended into chaos. What began with 2 girls in a minister's home spiraled into one of the most infamous witch hunts in history. Over 200 accused, 20 executed, and at the center of it all, faith, fear, and the fragile bonds of a divided community. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we unravel the Salem Witch Trials and explore how belief, power, and panic collided in colonial America.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we are moving a lot forward in time from our series of episodes on the Roman Empire and moving into colonial America. And we're dealing with something that definitely lives in the folklore of a lot of stories and a lot of media, and just it's something that just really strikes at the imagination of a lot of people. And that's the Salem Witch Trials in New England in the 1500s. So this is going to be very interesting because we're going to focus today on someone named Samuel Parris, who is a reverend of Salem Village at the time and is a really key actor in this entire concept of essentially people being branded as witches, going through a trial, and then ultimately being hung for their wickedness, if you will. And this is going to be super interesting because I think I know this story more from a Hollywood standpoint, thinking of witches being burned versus hung is like little things like that. But these are one of those ones that I think things get a little bit, I don't know if you'd say like scary, because it's something that you just see, a whole town come together and start, picking off individual people's, really going after their neighbors. And I think that's what makes this episode so interesting as we talk about, really true human nature, at a time which is, not too far in the past, relatively speaking.
Yeah, I agree with your kind of point there on how the Salem witch trial specifically has been, and I'll call it Hollywoodized in recent memory. So there is this kind of entertainment factor that I think exists around it. And that's why it comes up often in like just common discussion when, you're talking about scary movies or hauntings and things of that nature. And I think it is actually pretty haunting because this isn't really like an isolated event. As we'll get into it, there are other examples of witch hunts with way more loss of life, but this one in particular sticks in the human psyche for some reason.
Yeah, maybe part of it is because it happens in America and it's at the beginning of the country, well before it's founded, but just kind of the beginning of that settler culture within New England. Maybe that's part of it, but also too, I think it's so specific compared to some of the other witch trials we've seen in Europe, where it's a much larger scale over a larger period of time. I think this one, it's so concentrated into, a year and a half roughly in a small area of the country. Things are happening in and around that area. And some argue that it shouldn't really be called the Salem Witch Trials. It should be the entire county witch trials because things are happening in and around there. But yeah, there's something that really just sticks with this one. And I think that's what's going to be the interesting conversation today is why does this stick so much more than things happening in Germany or in France or in Scotland, really around this time and even before that are really all based in the same, it's a witch hunt at the end of the day, right? Why does this one stick so much? And I think that's the question we're going to try to answer today, specifically about this one, because there's something to it.
Yeah, I think what's going to be interesting for our listeners and what was interesting to me is the speed at which it happens, right? It goes from one incident and essentially catches like wildfire and spreads to surrounding villages and communities. And then the next thing you know, you have a full-scale witch hunt with, 20 people being executed and hundreds more being imprisoned within a very, very short span of time.
Yeah, it's not something you see really every day, but like even when you look at America, right, like it is very isolated to this. And we see versions of this throughout American history where there's, you get the lynchings in the South and things like that, where you're pointing at someone and there's always a level of religiosity to it. But this one is, you can point so clearly to some sort of religious elements because it is like possession, the devil, really like traditional kind of Christian good versus evil sort of things. And I think the Puritans themselves, who we're going to get into now, are are really key. Well, they are key to all of this, but learning about them and kind of their positioning, I think kind of helps tell the story really well. So this whole witch trial that we're going to be talking about today is really based within a Puritan community within America. And so who are these Puritans? And so without getting into any detail about the Protestant Reformation in Europe and the breaking away of the Church of England from the Catholic Church, because that's a whole thing in itself. But really all you need to know is the Church of England breaks away when King Henry VIII, there's some divorce elements to this and a few other things, but he essentially breaks away from the Catholic Church and creates the Church of England, which leads to Protestantism. And there's a growing group within England that sees this separation as going too far. They see themselves in a couple of ways. They see themselves closer to the more traditional Catholic faith that's being run out of Rome, but they also have more of a fundamentalist view and ideology when it comes to religion. And this is where things get interesting, because they don't just kind of sit off to the side and maybe do things quietly. They're really seen as a specific group, and they're starting to run into persecution problems where they're not able to really live in some areas alongside Protestants in the same way. And there's a few key differences that they have. You know, some of them are just very minute Christian differences that, to be honest, for this discussion don't really matter. So, for example, one of them being they take communion while they're seated versus Protestants take it while they're standing up. Those things I don't think are really going to describe why there was a witch trial. But really some of the things that are different are there's really strict moral codes. So you have things like Sabbath observance, so making sure that, you know, you're not doing anything, you're really resting on these days. There's issues around, you know, sexual conduct, alcohol, even theater, dancing, you know, music, really just not really having fun in that sense. So you really start to see a lot of this growing, and you really start to see these congregations where you have elders and ministers who are really starting to be leaders within these groups, but also from a legal standpoint as well. And especially as we start to move into America. So back in England, you know, they're really wanting to have more control over how their communities are run, but you have enough of a Protestant influence. You have the traditional legal system at the time, for whatever it's worth, kind of pushing and pulling towards that. And there's just enough clashing going on here that these Puritans are realizing that, you know, there's an opportunity to leave England, to move to a new place and start fresh. And that's the opportunity that they're going to take.
I think in terms of context, and when we're going to talk about Samuel Parris very shortly, I think you nail so many key points there in the backdrop you just gave us. And I think it's important to underpin some of those. One is, you know, the kind of movement of religious idea, obviously across the Atlantic into the US, and to establish these kind of congregations or communities that are so, you know, the linchpin that keeps these communities together is religion, at least the way that the Puritans see it, because it's supposed to essentially, you know, be the foundation of your entire life and behavior and kind of moral code. With that in mind, when we start looking at Samuel Parris, he was the minister of Salem Village during, obviously, the Salem Witch Trials, but he's born in London in 1653, and he's raised in Barbados. He was the son of a merchant who owned a sugar plantation, and he eventually made his way to Massachusetts, leaving behind his business career, which is very interesting, to study theology. And he became the minister of Salem Village in 1689. I think before I go deeper onto his bio, I think this is something very interesting about Salem Village in and of itself, and broadly speaking, many other communities. And I think, Paul, you touched on it, is the role in which religion plays at the communal level. So Salem in the 1680s was a community that was rife with tension, and much of it centered on church affairs. The village had only, you know, recently, before Samuel arrived, established a local congregation separate from the more larger and prosperous Salem town. So, you know, Salem Village is a little, you know, it's up and coming, is might be a way to look at it. And Parris is actually the fourth minister in 15 years, which doesn't sound like a lot to us, maybe, in the modern context, with just the removal of priests and like the Holy Order. But, you know, for the time being, that is a lot of movement and, you know, in a way, a lack of stability, you know, with the church playing such a foundational role. And all of these other ministers before him leave because of like acrimonious disputes within the communities. And a lot of it is because of personal differences that you touched upon on how you interpret doctrine, right? So you really have to be able to, you know, curry favor with your citizens or your the group that you're preaching to be able to do that. So he arrives in Salem Village, and he's not obviously met with unanimous support. He's very strict. He's an uncompromising preacher, so much so there's actually, a story where if people wanted to join him in, his sermons, they actually had to do a profession to the sanctity of God, based on how his interpretation went. So, he's very much a fundamentalist in that, right? And obviously, in some ways, it probably attracted a certain type of, member to the congregation. But in the same vein, it probably had the exact opposite effect, creating more tension with people who didn't necessarily interpret the Bible as he did. And I think this would lead to clashes with villagers over church policies and financial matters because those two were so closely coupled together, and obviously disagreements with his contract and control over church property, because that was a dual role that he played, kind of created very deep divisions long before the first even accusations of witchcraft surface. So I think it's an element of tension that you don't necessarily hear about right out the gate when you start talking about the Salem witch trials.
You can even really see this decentralization, really, that we just talked about these Puritans in England and not really having the autonomy that they wanted. Well, pick them up and put them into a brand new place with not a lot of central government, at least at this point. It will eventually come. And you're right, these villages start to become these like hotbeds for self-government and trying to almost have a little self-determination to themselves. And there's definitely external factors that are starting to put pressure on this. But being a leader of a Puritan village, your mayor, your religious leader, your kind of the legal experts, and you're someone that people are looking up to. And especially with Puritans being heavier on the preaching side of things, this is somebody who's going to be looked upon by the entire community in various ways, like you described. And even I think there's an interesting story too when he comes to the village. It's almost like they weren't sure if they were going to be able to get him because they couldn't afford him and stuff. And there's certain elements about that of like how much they were going to pay him to be there and make sure that they gave him proper accommodations, just to kind of give you an idea of, like people really wanted him there because of his ability to lead in the way that the Puritans would want, but also at the same time, well, we're not going to pay him whatever they're going to pay him, or we're not going to give him this house, or he's too radical, or he's too this. And you can start to see that fracturing. And it's not the reason a lot of these things happen, but it's one reason that we're going to start stacking upon, why this is going to turn into what it turns into. But I think it's a key point just of him coming in here, kind of being a little bit separate in a few different ways from what people are looking for, but ultimately kind of having that self-governance without a lot of external pressure and, being a very big character. It's all things that are going to kind of lead into building a little bit more of a more fundamentalist culture, I would say, within this little village.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think there's an element here that is probably going to sound very cynical, but I think as we get deeper into the story, we might see some opportunism and strategic and like political maneuvering on the behalf of Samuel as this, as the witch hunt kind of unfolds. So we can get into that now. So the trials themselves didn't actually begin in a courtroom or the church. They began in a household, and coincidentally, it's the house of Reverend Samuel Parris. So in early 1692, two young girls in his home, Betty, his 9-year-old daughter, and Abigail, his 11-year-old niece, began exhibiting very strange behaviors. They were screaming, they were contorting, they were falling into trances, and they claimed to be afflicted by invisible forces. So obviously this behavior is extremely alarming. And when no physical illnesses could explain it, the conclusion, which was deeply rooted in kind of this Puritan worldview, they were labeled as being the victims of witchcraft, which, kind of sets the initial spark. Parris, who is this devout fundamentalist Puritan, takes the situation very seriously. And I think this is where the room for interpretation from our end kind of comes into play, is that, his belief in the devil's power combined with his role as a spiritual leader of the village pushed him to treat these events not as isolated incidents, but as signs of a larger kind of, spiritual attack. So this diagnosis quickly escalates into a public crisis. And then next thing you know, accusations just begin and everyone is pointing the finger at everybody.
Yeah, it's crazy how quickly it happens. But one thing I think we should clarify when we talk about witchcraft, right? Like when we think of witches today and we talked about the Hollywoodization of witches and all of this, this isn't, his daughter's acting like this, therefore she's got a green face and a broom and a cauldron that's bubbling and she's flying around at night with a big hat on. This is really a belief that the devil is always at work and he's always trying to come for you, and that he kind of employs these spirits, if you will, that are always kind of moving around and looking for people that they can influence in some way. And so there's always this back and forth about, like, do these people let these spirits in, or they make a deal with the devil where they're, given some sort of power, to get ahead in life, but the devil and his, I guess, minions, if you will, have the ability to take over your body when they see fit and when they need to. And so let's just put that in your head. If you believe all of that and you see people acting in this way, it goes back to, I remember when we were talking about the Aztecs. We were talking about how they were executing people and doing all these blood sacrifices. And we're like, oh my goodness, how could anybody even think about that? Well, when you read why they did it, the reason was they believed if they didn't do these blood sacrifices, the gods wouldn't have enough blood to keep the universe from essentially dying off and everybody dying. So they're like, look, we got to do it. It's just the way things work. And there's always other reasons for things. But it's important to understand that, because at first we're like, what do you mean witches? And we don't understand things. There's a million reasons why they believe this, but also that is one of the core fundamental beliefs of just how the world works in this society. And if you're basing everything off that, it's not a far line to go from, we have to do something about these people because, look how they're behaving. Look, the devil's at work here. And that's, like, obviously number one enemy on any religious person's hit list.
Yeah, I think that's probably a point to double down on, which is that, holding these beliefs does not make him unique or kind of an outlier in any way. It's pretty common understanding at this point in time. There's agreement, I should say, amongst, like, New England ministers. They agreed that the devil was real, witches could exist. There was a belief in the supernatural, and that God may actually allow Satan to test the community as a part of, this holier kind of test that was going to be given to whose ever congregation.
And there's one other interesting thing here too, and we'll get into the gender elements of this too, but just in Puritan society, they actually have this belief where, we start off on a good foot. Men and women completely equal in the eyes of God, which is great, very progressive. We love to see that. But the devil doesn't see men and women in the same way. The devil actually sees women as being easier to essentially take over their souls, and he's able to essentially enact his evil ways on women much easier than men. And so women are always trying to push away attempts from the devil to kind of take over. So in their eyes, when they see these things happening, that's why we get a little bit of this. Well, I'm not sure it's the reason, but it is part of the reason why we're going to see not everybody be women who's accused here, but definitely see a push towards, 70 to 80% of the accused being on, the female side. But again, it's the way they're coming up at this is this attacks by the devil need to be stopped. And unfortunately for women, they are more susceptible, and, it's their job to kind of push it back, but sometimes, things happen and they fail.
Yeah, and I think this is where the story gets really interesting. So, we've talked about the role of a minister at this point. They kind of serve as the moral authority. And this is something that religion isn't necessarily private or optional. It's Puritan New England. So it is, it's undercutting everything that we're talking about. And we've already established that Samuel totally embraced this worldview, and he was deeply suspicious of anyone who kind of challenged his authority. And he often preached that the community was under spiritual attack. So when his daughter and his niece began behaving very strangely, screaming, convulsing, it's the devil's work that came to his mind immediately in Salem's village. The holy community is being attacked by the devil. So instead of calming the situation, and this is where a lot of historians are very critical of his actions, Parris's sermons and actions fan the flames. He encourages the girls to name those who were afflicting them and supported the legal proceedings that followed. His household kind of became the epicenter of the first accusations, starting with his enslaved servant, Tituba, and he played a key role in kind of shaping public perception of what was happening. I don't want to say pulling the puppet strings necessarily, but there is an element of kind of trying to control the narrative, I think, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, and there's a communal element to this too, where I think he's seeing this happen to some members of the community. Therefore, the entire community must be affected in some way. And it's all of our responsibility to stop this. But you're right. He went right to there must be more. There must be bad things happening. Let's get hysteria up to the peak that it can get up to, instead of trying to maybe, brush things under the rug or deal with things in the way that he should. good. But again, I come back to, if this is the way he believes, and he's in a group of people who are very fundamentalist and believe these things, and we'll get into the life that they're living is definitely not an easy one. And they're seeing a lot of things around them that are really starting to make them question if they are in God's favor. And we've talked about this a million times on many different episodes around bad things are happening and religious persecutions seem to follow, or very religious elements seem to follow, because people look and go, well, if these bad things are happening, we must have done something to piss off God or the gods. And, here we are, right? So there's all these little elements, but yeah, he's definitely the type of guy that, based on what we've heard about him so far, that, yeah, he's going to dial things up and really set this whole thing in motion.
I think you nailed it there. The community is God's covenant people. They're under assault by the devil. And then this whole thing gets supercharged by the religious meaning, kind of, spreads like wildfire. So, not to discredit him in any way, but I think he does take the situation very seriously in his own way, because of the beliefs that he does hold. But the first three women actually accused of afflicting the girls were his the slave that he had, Tituba, Sarah Good, who was a poor beggar, and Sarah Osborne, a much sickly older woman. All three were kind of considered outsiders in Puritan society. But I want to draw special attention to Tituba's very, very dramatic confession. So most people accused would obviously, deny the involvement of witchcraft, but Tituba did something very different. She confessed, and what she actually said, historians think, transformed the crisis into a full-blown witch hunt. Under pressure of, torture or, most likely execution, she described in very vivid detail how she was approached by a tall man dressed in black, assumed to be the devil, who promised her freedom if she would serve him. She claimed she had signed the devil's book and seen the marks or signatures of other witches on it. Names she said she couldn't read, but claimed there were many. She told magistrates that she flew through the air on poles with other witches, that she had seen strange animals, a yellow bird, a red cat, and even hairy creatures that walked like men. She described baking a witch cake, this is really interesting, made from rye meal and urine, used in folk magic to identify afflictors. She said she was sometimes blindfolded or tricked into participating in rituals, suggesting that others were behind it. But here's the claim that, really just pushed things to the next level, which is that there were other witches working with her, plotting to destroy the Puritan community. She didn't name any at first and kind of create an open-ended threat, confirming, the fears of the community in many ways. But her confession was so vivid, so dramatic, kind of biblical to some degree, that it seemed impossible for the community to ignore.
Yeah. Just could you imagine you just hearing all of these things? Yeah, I've been doing all these things with various witches and this tall man in black who we all know is the devil, but I'm not actually going to say it's the devil. And next thing you know, and oh, by the way, there's more witches here, and they could be amongst you, out in the village anywhere. And we're talking a village of 500-600 people, roughly. Like, it's not a big place, right? Everybody knows everybody. And so, yeah, you can see why this kicks off in the way that it does. And it's quite vivid, those accounts, despite the fact, things started so small. And yeah, we can definitely look at Samuel Parris for kind of heightening things, but that is quite the confession and quite the statement that she makes. Yeah.
As you can imagine, right? Regardless of her intent, which we don't actually know, the result was immediate. Obviously, panic just spreads, en masse. Other girls begin confessing and accusing each other. There's a belief, that the satanic conspiracy was hiding within Salem gained traction. And it might not have moved or expanded as quickly if it were not for Tituba's confession. Ironically, however, she's jailed over a year, but is never executed. In this kind of weird, tragic irony, her cooperation saved her life, while dozens of others who denied it, were sentenced to death.
So is, in this case, I guess, from what you're saying, sounds like if you're going in, you're thrown on trial, and you actually admit, you seem like you're jailed for a time, but ultimately set free. But then if you don't admit to it, that's when we're seeing these executions start. So I think that kind of maybe explains this whole vivid story may have just been a way to keep herself alive, it sounds like.
Yeah, I would venture to guess that if she's able to create such a vivid narrative of what happened to her, and maybe she paints herself as a victim, not necessarily an aggressor. The church punishes her much more softly than they do others. They're not getting burned at the stake or drowned or pushed off a cliff, or, there's something called pressing that I came across. She just gets sentenced to a year in your local jail.
Which I guess, like, from her standpoint, she did what she needed to do to survive. And I'm sure, it just adds to that hysteria, right? Of, well, if you admit and tell these vivid stories that kind of meet the narrative of what everybody's expecting and saying, look, I'm this victim, I'll admit to all of this, I was tricked, I was fooled, save my life, versus people who are kind of a little bit more stuck in their ways and saying, no, I won't admit to this never happened. All right, well, you're going to get executed. And, now the fingers are going to start getting pointed. And one thing that I went into a little bit was, how did these kind of go down? Was this proper legal system of the day where you'd put in a complaint and there'd be an arrest warrant and all these things? Obviously, I think we all know the answer is no to that. But really, it was essentially kind of trial by fire in a sense, where you bring this person in almost the same day, put them in a crowded courthouse, and just start throwing accusations at them. And, there's no defense counsel at this time. There's nothing like that. And it was, question after question after question, demands to recite certain prayers perfectly. And if you messed up, that's a sign. And, and you have to watch their reaction every time you say something. Like, you're under this microscope, and, they're really just trying to find ways to prove you're guilty. It's really the opposite of innocent until proven guilty. It's more kind of guilty until proven innocent. And they would do these weird tests too, where they would do something called the touch test. So if they had someone who was convulsing, and I'm not sure how they always found all these people who were convulsing just in time for these trials, which again is another thing. And if the accused touched the person who was convulsing and they stopped, that was proof that they were actually a witch, because they had some sort of special power over this person. They would look for like birthmarks and different things and claim that they were the witch's mark. And so there's just a lot of bizarre things that they really did. And eventually these indictments would come down, and it was just very, again, it is that kind of that Hollywood kind of feeling of these people kind of sitting behind a bench accusing someone, the crowd kind of heckling them and kind of rinsing and repeating, and really coming down to using things called spectral evidence, which is more just, hey, I saw things in a vision, or I saw things through essentially things that that were quickly outlawed as, things that were allowed to be used in court quite soon after this. And so you see a lot of things like that. And it was a simple guilty or not guilty sort of situation here. So again, very early stages in sort of legality and really any sort of legal system, if you can even call it that. But really this, like the term witch hunts, it makes sense when you think about it. We're trying to get this person to confess. We're trying to make them look guilty, and we're going to invent silly ways to prove their guilt, but we're not even going to give them a chance really to prove that they're innocent unless they confess, which I think just kind of, again, adds more, not even fuel, like gasoline to this fire.
And I think this is where some of the historical analysis is very interesting. So obviously we've discussed that he's kind of fanning the flames at this point, right? And some historians argue that he seizes this moment as an opportunity. And, obviously the intention of why he does it is always going to be up to debate. Some historians think, it wasn't necessarily because of malice, but with his kind of religious conviction. In his world, the outbreak of witchcraft wasn't just a coincidence. It was, kind of proof of everything he'd been preaching. So his critic and rivals who had long resisted his authority, now they're seen as kind of spiritually compromised because he's been right all the time. And now these people, could potentially even be dangerous. There's more outsiders in this covenant that we're trying to nurture. So the trials kind of give him power and a way to assert control over a divided and already contentious village. And here's a very interesting little historical footnote. Some historians have even done like the actual analysis on the accusers themselves, and through analysis of what I would imagine would be letters, whatever documents exist, or, court proceedings. The majority of the accusers in the 1962 outbreak were families that were loyal to him and belonging to his church, whereas a large proportion of the accused witches were from families that had not joined the church and were, outwardly critical of his preaching and religious conviction.
It really just sounds more and more like, cult leader, devote people like loyal to him. And yeah, now you have this, like, you're either with us or you're against us, and more just elements to this whole story. But yeah, it's kind of fits the narrative kind of pretty well here. If, people who are getting accused are kind of outside that circle. But the more we kind of think about this, the more we're breaking it down to just kind of basic human fights, if you will, that we see of one person trying to gain influence. You have our group versus your group. And we've talked about it, my God is better than your God, the more grand battles. But in this case, it's, down to a more micro scale, and it's a little bit more personal, which I think makes things a little bit more kind of scary in this sense. But that is an interesting piece of historical analysis for sure. And
again, it's just one piece of historical analysis. We'll get into how, perspectives and opinions have changed over time on, how historians perceive, the Salem Witch Trials, Samuel, and all the other people involved. It is a world actually, very deep with a lot of different angles of analysis. But for our purposes, what's not in doubt, I think, regardless of his intention, his opportunism, is his influence. He is wielding a large amount of influence at this time. His home is essentially ground zero. His daughter and niece were the first accusers. His enslaved servant gave the first confession, and his voice from the pulpit and the witness stand carried throughout the entire colony. And this is where hysteria just continues to spiral, right? Where you're seeing those kind of magistrates pop up. You're seeing a lot of these trials just en masse. And this is where, there starts to be some scrutiny about his preaching and his sermons in terms of how effective he is at fanning the flame and pushing this to a level where he's starting to get criticized.
Yeah, it just kind of keeps rolling forward, and you're right. He's going to keep pushing, but at the end of the day, these are witch hunts. Nobody likes witch hunts, and again, the fact that it's personal, you may not have been a big fan, but then your wife is accused, and now you're against it, or your friend gets accused, and at some point people are going to look at this and go, all right, this is getting out of hand. And especially too, of you've executed so many people, you think, okay, we've got, if you even believe in this, you're probably like, okay, have we not got all these witches that you've been accusing, and we're still going through this? Is this ever going to end? Is there going to be even anybody left by the end of this? And I think you're right. You're going to start to see a lot of resistance coming up, because again, why wouldn't there be? This is just the natural course of things. Something like this can't last forever, especially in a town of, only 600-700 people.
I think that's one of the interesting things about this particular episode, right? Because when we were talking prior to starting the recording, witch hunts are, I don't want to say they're uncommon or common, but at this point in history, they are happening, right, across Europe, and that is a reality. But there's something very specific about this one, and I think we touched on at the beginning, is the pace at which it happens. But the hysteria that kind of rises as fast as it fades at the end of 1692, the people of Salem start to reflect, and, hindsight is always 20/20, and there is some regret that starts to kind of build up in the community. And this, leaves the community in a bit of turmoil. And at the center of this, soon to be reckoning is Samuel Parris, when people start asking, how did this happen? How did we prison so many, predominantly women? How did we kill 20 women? And, who do we point the finger at and blame? And ultimately it becomes him.
I find that so interesting, because you just went through witch trials, witch hunts, scapegoating of these women and a few men based on everything that you've seen to, purify this community. Why did that all happen? We're all mad about that. We need to go on a witch hunt now and find someone who started it, which I find, again, it is just very human nature to point to one or two specific people and really blame them. He absolutely has some blame here, but you can't arrest human nature, and you can't arrest an entire village for being hopped up in this entire situation. But yeah, you're ultimately in charge, and things are going to come back at you quite hard. And, now he's got to deal with this, the reckoning that he's kind of due, I think, at this point.
Yeah. And it's not immediate, it's slow, but it's steady. So a couple of years later, by 1695, church members now have formally petitioned his removal. They're accusing him of being divisive and inflexible and, unwilling to reconcile any kind of disagreements. So under this mounting pressure, he gives a public apology in 1967. So we're talking 5 years removed now from the trials, at least at the kind of peak that they had reached. And he acknowledges that he erred in his judgment during the trials, but the apology was too little too late, and for many, way too shallow. His authority, within the community is essentially broken, and his congregation is deeply divided. In 1696, he officially resigns as the minister of Salem Village. He leaves behind this community that's kind of still scarred by, the fear, grief, and guilt of what happened with the trials. And, it's a reputation that still endures and lasts till this day. That's why we're talking about it. To his furthering his story, he actually continues to serve as a minister somewhere else, in a smaller, quieter town like Stowe or Dunstable, which is kind of, just outside of Salem. And, I think his story is pretty interesting in the sense that conviction without reflection and power without restraint can turn, fear into a very, strange reality of injustice, for many, if it's left unchecked.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, like the scale that this happens, we're looking at about 20 people who are killed, 19 are hanged. Another thing to notice, like nobody's burned here. I think that's always something that I thought is, we're burning witches. That doesn't happen here. And, we see this happening throughout Europe, but at that's a larger scale, but not necessarily, I guess you'd almost call it like the density that it's happening here. But there's a whole bunch of things I think that come together here. And you're right, like there's definitely some unchecked elements to it, but it's also a perfect storm. So we talked about the Puritanism for sure, number one. Number two is this is very, very hard living in New England. Like these are harsh winters. These are people just scraping by. So they're already kind of at a hyper alert state because, this might be their last year, right? Who knows? They could have a bad harvest and everything goes away. But the third thing we haven't talked about is they are at war with the indigenous populations. And this is early on. And this is not, when we talk about indigenous relations with America and the indigenous folk, where kind of the American army and smallpox are kind of running rampant through those villages or those groups. This is more, the indigenous are actually seen as having, I wouldn't say necessarily the upper hand, but they are really feared. And so there's something I wanted to call out here called King Philip's War. And so this is essentially a war between, mostly in New England, around just fighting for land. It kind of goes for about 3 years between these people coming over and the variety of different indigenous tribes within the area. And so it really starts with the execution of 3 men who are indigenous for the murder of a Christian Indian. On top of, we have land seizures, debt collection raids, and just a whole bunch of things. But really, there's just these incredibly violent battles that go out, and you start to see situations where entire villages are wiped out. So Native army will roll in, burn the place to the ground. Colonizers will go back, burn down that village, and it's getting very brutal. And we see some estimates that, some people actually argue that this is the bloodiest war in American history just because of the fact that there wasn't a lot of people there yet and a lot of people died. Some will say the Civil War is probably higher, but if you, based on your calculations, it's in the top 2 or 3 of most bloody American wars. And so what you're seeing actually come into Salem is refugees. People whose villages have been burned down, people who have seen their families slaughtered by these raids coming in, or have gone the other way and raided indigenous tribes. And, it's very, very brutal. But at the heart of all of this is you have this look upon the indigenous as ungodly, unchristian, probably working for the devil, right? We're the Puritans. We're creating this new Israel, as they like to call it, in New England. And these indigenous people are trying to wipe that away. They must be working with the devil. They must be, godless savages, if you will. And so when you have that kind of mindset, you're already kind of seeing the outcome of the devil being unchecked, if you will, if you put yourself in that mindset. Now you've lived that, you've got all this trauma. Now you move to Salem, and guess what? Not only is it potentially happening again, but it's coming from within the house this time. These are your neighbors. These are people who are within your community, not outsiders or foreigners. And I think it just all breeds so perfectly into Samuel Parris coming in with his kind of mentality, the way he goes about things, and you kind of stick all these things together and you really create almost the perfect storm. And like you said, Richie, it's unchecked. So until someone steps in, this fire is going to continue to burn until eventually, thankfully, it does end.
I think you made such an important point in your analysis there, not just in terms of like King Philip's War, but, this whole idea of like refugees or people who are coming from other broken, villages that have essentially been wiped, off the map. I think there's so many intriguing lenses of analysis for the Salem witch trials, and I think that's partly why we always keep coming back to it. I think that's why it exists in, the human psyche still. And, most people have heard of it because there's so many unique ways to look at what happened here, what went wrong. And the one thing that I was curious about when I was doing some of the biographical research was just how have historians kind of framed their analysis over the years. As you can imagine, the earliest kind of framing was, through a moral and religious lens. Then you kind of move to this kind of rationalist psychological approach. This is, the early Enlightenment is kind of, showing its face for the first time. So people are trying to make like psychological explanations as to why this happened. The girls were faking it, suffering from delusions, acting out against authority. And then, in the mid 20th century, you see these kind of socio-political interpretations. This is a community that's afflicted by war. They're divided by class tension, property disputes, power struggles within the church. And then, more recently, we have kind of the gender and feminist perspectives on, why were so many women accused. And I think, Paul, you did a good job providing that kind of theological rationale as to why women were more susceptible to the devil. And then very recently, it's been this interdisciplinary approach, which is, kind of looking at everything all in one through this kind of lens of a legal culture and understanding how broader narratives that could have been brought in by, Atlantic world connections, because his slave is kind of at the epicenter of this. What did Caribbean folklore have to do to propel these ideas of the devil forward? And I think this is why, we're still talking about in the 21st century. Historians are still taking time to study it and provide and come up with new theses. And I think it is a very fascinating, dark point in human history, like many of the other witch hunts are. But I think the uniqueness of this is because we keep coming back to it, because there's so many ways to interpret how it happened. I don't think you're ever going to find one answer. I think it's probably a little bit of all of these things.
No question about it. There's so many pieces to this, the religious elements, the just desperation of these people, the influence of Samuel Parris. It just all kind of has to come together in a certain way, and just certain things we find in history. If a couple dominoes fall in the right way, things happen, and sometimes it's some pretty tragic outcomes. And, there is some things going around, and we'll just debunk it really quickly, about tainted grain and those sort of things that, everyone was just eating tainted grain and they started hallucinating like crazy and everyone went nuts. And that's why this whole thing happened. Most historians have debunked that quite easily, saying, we would have seen this in other places. We would have had more reports about this. And that's not really what we're seeing. So definitely that tries to kind of give that one size fits all to this problem that happened. But I think you're right, Richie. There's so many pieces to this, and I think we've done a pretty good job covering a lot of it that I think really wrap up why this happened. And I think one piece to just to kind of get why this is such a big deal. Not only is it a big deal to us today, we see the aftermath of this is quite insane, actually. We see pardons and actually restitution paid to the victims only a few decades after this actually happens. So very quickly, the people of New England and the government are realizing this is a complete disaster. We have to make radical changes, and we need to make these people whole again, because this is complete insanity that this even happened. And you even see the founding fathers referencing the Salem witch trials when they're talking about how they're going to create this new country. So there was a great question that I saw brought up to a few historians on the subject, and someone said, essentially, how much was the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, more specifically the Bill of Rights, influenced by the Salem witch trials? And in my head, when I first thought of the question, I was like, it's probably not that much, maybe a little bit. But the historians were really experts on this subject. They really said it was actually quite a big element of this, because they really saw when people didn't have rights. People didn't have the right to a defense attorney, for example. They didn't have, there's cruel and unusual punishment and all of these things to really base a legal system around. You've seen the absence of this in Salem, and you see where it can go without those things. And it's actually such a popular narrative. And so I think the fact that it was so big at the time and kind of has that lasting impact into the founding of the United States, I think really goes to show that, this isn't just, hey, Hollywood made a big deal about it, so therefore it's big today, and all those sort of things. But this really is a key element in the founding of, the legal system and the Bill of Rights and how America is going to function really as a country, which I think is probably one of the biggest reasons why when we think about, this whole thing, it just seems so unjust and so unfair. And I think the founding fathers are trying to build a country that was more fair and more just to more people than before. So I think that's kind of where I think we see it. We see that comparison, and it makes it easier to understand why it's become so popular and sits in our minds so well.
I think there's this element of restitution that kind of cuts through what you just said, right? Like, or this kind of idea of maybe there's a silver lining here, more or less, not to take too much of an optimistic view, but the fact that this didn't just go, unaddressed like many things do when we talk about history, that there was some, retroactive compensation fixing of, the legal system. And it's not something that we got really deep into, but I think the implications of what, a standardized judicial system looks like, this really kind of pushed the envelope on that. And I think, it's a great piece to kind of walk away with, to understand how these types of events can shape history, directly or indirectly.
Yeah, it has that it's just got that punch to it, right? And whether it's directly or indirectly, we're still talking about it today. And I think one lesson we've learned throughout doing all of these episodes is people at the time are talking about it. It's probably a big deal. And those are the best ways to kind of look at these situations. And thankfully, very soon after this, right, you see people go, the injustice is just so obvious. And they're like, we can't have that happen again. This isn't something that we're looking, hundreds of years later saying, well, that was a mistake, we should make changes. This is, decades later. And, we're seeing that restitution paid so quickly. It just goes to show how big of an event this was, and just how it really hit at the hearts of everybody who was involved. And I think that's, again, like part of the reason why it's hitting so hard for today, but also the fact that I think it just seems like it could happen to anybody. Not that we're going to have witch hunts or anything today, but, just being labeled as an outsider, as a bad person, if you will, inside your community, I think is a deeply human thing. And we've seen it throughout history of, scapegoating and being banished, and all of those sort of things are like really deeply troubling things that really kind of hit at the human psyche. And we're seeing this here at a more grand and kind of fantasy scale, if you will. But this is something that we see all the time, even up to the modern day. So, yeah, again, it's just a little bit more of why I think that punch is hitting, because it's happening within this small community, and it's, neighbor, pointing out neighbor versus, it's not like an external army coming in or an external force. It's the guy who lives next door to you is accusing you of being a witch or something like that.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think when you strip this all away, there's the theological, historical analysis that people continue to do. But at the end, at its core, this is a story of, a small community filled with people who are traumatized with what is going on around them, and are living a very harsh, difficult life and trying to make sense of the world that they're in. And, the fragility of that can be taken away so quick if a charismatic leader who's able to say the right things to the right amount of people can really shift it, the direction of a community. This is definitely a topic, I think, that engaged me more than I thought it would. And I think this type of episode is definitely something we'll revisit in the future.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.